Each of these disasters could have been easily avoided. Instead, countless victims met their demise when they were least expecting it. A surprise birthday party takes a harrowing turn, leaving 20 people dead and dozens of families devastated.
We just got out of the car as fast as we could because we thought there was a tree falling down, an explosion. We didn't know what it was.
It soon spirals into America's deadliest transportation disaster in recent history. Was it sheer negligence or an inescapable tragedy? On October 6, 2018, Amy Steenberg's friends and family planned to celebrate her 30th birthday at a brewery about an hour away. After the initial limo rental was canceled at the last minute, they hastily hired one from Prestige Limousine of Wilton. The white stretch limousine they ordered was a customized 2001 Ford Excursion XLT. The massive SUV, weighing 10,000 pounds, underwent a dramatic transformation. It was split in half and seamlessly welded together, extending its length by an additional 12 feet, effectively morphing it into a bus-like structure. At approximately 1:30 p.m., the limousine pulled up, and the group of 17 eagerly boarded the vehicle. Among them were 4 sisters, 2 brothers, 3 Army veterans, and 2 newlywed couples. Inside the excursion, the celebrants were greeted by flashy neon lights, worn-out padded benches, and floorboards marred by rust. One of the partygoers reached out to a friend who had initially planned to join, but decided against it, saying, "The limo sounds like it's going to explode. Yes, haha, it's a junker, literally. The motor is making everyone deaf." The limousine headed out of Amsterdam and onto Route 30, a winding 2-lane road that cuts through the countryside toward the brewery in Cooperstown, about an hour's drive from Montgomery County, New York. The group was enjoying themselves, taking photos and chatting as they rode along. However, not long into the trip, something went horribly wrong. As the car drove down a steep hill towards a T-junction in Schoharie, the driver urgently hit the brakes, but to his horror, the brake system failed. The limousine's speed rapidly increased, quickly surpassing 100 miles per hour. Desperate to avoid a collision where the car stopped at the intersection, the driver made a split-second decision to veer over the double pavement striping, bypassing the stop sign and careening into the driveway of a nearby restaurant. On the opposite side of the road, nestled in the parking lot of a country store, the excursion collided with a parked Toyota Highlander, hurtling the SUV 80 feet through the air. 2 unsuspecting pedestrians, a father and son-in-law, were tragically caught in the path of destruction when the Highlander fatally struck them. Sadly, the calamity did not end there. Despite ramming into the Highlander, the excursion continued at a speed of around 80 miles per hour towards its final resting place. The violent impact of trees sent fragments of debris flying through the air. The sound of shattering glass and twisting metal reverberated through the air. The limousine ultimately came to rest in a ditch, with the engine bay nearly flattened. Surprisingly, the exterior of the passenger compartment appeared eerily intact, masking the gruesome reality within. The collision instantly claimed the lives of 16 individuals as the force of the impact caused fatal injuries. The absence of seatbelts exacerbated the situation, leading to further harm as the passengers' bodies collided within the cabin. Emergency responders were quickly dispatched to the scene, but the situation was dire.
They grabbed the jaws. I fired the jaws up. They went down there. Within 2 minutes, they had that car open. We were pulling bodies out. They were still alive. And we kept going.
In the aftermath, the death toll rose to 20, with 2 additional lives lost within hours. This included all 18 individuals in the limousine. It was one of the deadliest transportation accidents in recent history, leaving behind shattered families and grieving friends. The extent of the tragedy had such a profound impact on experienced paramedics that they suffered severe mental health issues due to the distressing scene they encountered at the crash site. After the crash, an intensive investigation began to uncover the causes and potential factors at play. It wasn't long before a series of troubling information came to light. The limousine was in poor condition, with numerous mechanical issues that had not been addressed. Federal authorities had found that the company that stretched the limo in 2001 didn't have the required license and failed to upgrade the brakes to handle the extra weight. And even though the State Department of Transportation classified the excursion as a bus because of its size, it hadn't gone through the necessary certification or inspection process. More troublingly, the department had issued 2 separate orders for the limo to be taken off the road in the months leading up to the accident. Despite this, the sticker indicating the vehicle's unfitness was missing at the time of the crash. Additionally, the company had already been ordered to surrender the registration and license plates for all his vehicles, including the limo, because of previous violations. Federal records show the company had received 22 citations for violations within 24 months before the crash. In September, 3 of their vehicles failed inspections and were cited for infractions, such as defective emergency exits and malfunctioning brakes. The driver was not properly licensed to operate the vehicle. He was also not subjected to mandatory drug testing, as an autopsy would later reveal the presence of THC in his system. Numerous lap seatbelts in the limousine went unnoticed by the passengers because they were hidden beneath the benches. They were only found when investigators removed the seats post-crash. While some visible lap and shoulder belts were present, it remains unclear why none of the passengers had buckled up. As investigations progressed, unsettling questions emerged regarding the limo company's clandestine ties to law enforcement. Shahed Hussein, the company's owner, had a controversial past, having been an informant for the FBI in a terrorism investigation. However, he had returned to his native Pakistan 6 months before the crash. But Shahed's connections couldn't shield him from impending legal actions. In March 2019, a grand jury indicted him and his son, Nauman, on charges of manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. The charges alleged that the younger Hussein had allowed the limousine to remain in service despite knowing it was unsafe. In fact, state officials had declared it unfit for use a month prior. Though prosecutors alleged that Nauman removed the out-of-service sticker from the windshield and that his actions had directly contributed to the deaths of the passengers. After initially entering a plea of not guilty, Hussein struck a deal with prosecutors in February 2021. In exchange for pleading guilty to 20 counts of criminally negligent homicide, 1 count of manslaughter, and 1 count of assault, Hussein was sentenced to probation and community service, but avoided prison time. But his time in court wasn't over. The outcome sparked fury among the victims' families, who felt justice was left unserved. In August 2022, a judge dismissed the deal as fundamentally flawed, saying it failed to acknowledge Hussein's awareness of the risks. As a result, Nauman Hussein withdrew his plea. More than 5 years after the tragic accident, justice would finally be done.
Today, he was sentenced to 5 to 15 years after hearing heart-wrenching statements from 9 different family members. A juror said it was the limo operator's repeated efforts to skirt DOT rules and regulations, his lack of maintenance on the limo that led to this guilty verdict.
While the sentence handed down is less than the families had hoped for, their advocacy for safety and reform in the transport sector has prompted tangible change in the industry with the Limo Safe legislation. The new mandate calls for stricter vehicle inspections, amplified oversight of limo operating companies, and the incorporation of additional safety equipment in the vehicles. The next disaster was a nightmare waiting to happen. When it finally struck, one family had their camera rolling. Amid the serene mountains of northern Spain, a summer retreat rapidly transforms into a nightmare. From inside their camper, Jose Soleil, his wife, and daughter watch a torrent of water flow unstoppably below their window. Now, everything is gone. Just a few trailers are stuck to trees and waves of muddy water around them. Despite the gravity of the situation, the family is safe now. A wave flood carrying logs and rocks had stormed through. The sudden onslaught threw them into a desperate struggle for survival, the shadow of death looming. Dozens of others weren't as lucky. It came out of nowhere and caught them by surprise. Except for a few who knew it was only a matter of time before the inevitable. On the morning of Wednesday, August 7th, 1996, the Spanish National Institute of Meteorology issued a warning about the incoming storm for the northern part of the country. Heavy summer rains are frequent for this region, but according to experts, this one was more intensive, with the province of Aragon expected to be the most affected. And nestled in the north of it, deep in the Pyrenees mountain range, lies the Sierra de las Nieves campsite, one of the most beautiful in inland Spain at the time. The award-winning facility opened 6 years earlier and was renowned for its quality. In August, over 600 guests registered at the site. Even though many had decided to go on excursions, the place was swarming with people unfazed by the rain. After all, one summer shower definitely couldn't change their mood. When it started to pour in the late afternoon, people withdrew into their tents and campers and waited for the rain to stop. However, half an hour later, it was getting heavier. Nevertheless, it still didn't seem to bother the guests. Tucked away in their tents, they were unaware they were resting in a death trap. Las Nieves campsite was built on a sediment deposit at the foothold of two steep hills, but, more importantly, at the exit of the Aras ravine that runs between them. Over the years, it has been prone to powerful torrents of water rushing through its channel during periods of heavy rainfall. The estimated rainfall at the campsite was 200 to 250 millimeters on that day of the disaster. About 1/4 of that rainfall came down in just 8 minutes. The ground couldn't absorb that much water, so all the excess flowed down the ravine, picking up logs and rocks. This caused a blockage at the bridge, which broke under pressure, sending a wave of water and debris into the campsite. In just a few moments, calmness gave way to panic. As the wave swept through, guests were thrown into a fight for survival. Many were caught by surprise and had no time to escape. They struggled to stay afloat as the water carried them downstream, along with tents, furniture, cars, and even large campers. One of the survivors remembers how the current dragged him and his family. Somehow, he got trapped in the branches of a falling tree. He was lucky as he climbed it and found rescue in the high canopy. But unfortunately, his parents and 2 brothers were taken away by the torrent. Guests caught by the torrent while in their campers were somewhat better positioned as they were out of direct reach of the water. Yet, they were trapped inside their vans and trailers, floating like boats on the water. Like the teen, those trapped in the trees were lucky, as they were saved from being swept away by the flood.
My son shouted, "We're going to die." And I said, "No, we're not, son, but watching the news today, some kids have. But mine haven't."
As time passed, the water level declined, and the flood lost its destructive power. Nevertheless, the rain was still pouring, and brown, muddy water flowed through the camp, preventing people from escaping or reaching those still in danger. Precious time was lost until the water dropped to a safe level. Despite being deeply distraught by the tragedy, there was no time to lose as many people still had to be rescued. Luckily, the news of the disaster quickly reached the nearby village of Biescas and its residents, along with a small firefighting team that rushed to assist. They sent out an all-out call for help, and by nightfall, hundreds of soldiers, Red Cross members, and volunteers were at the site. Throughout the night, they worked diligently to rescue as many people as possible. All injured were transferred to Biescas, where they received first aid before being sent to a hospital. Sadly, as the rescue operation progressed, the first victims of the flood appeared. But by then, the darkness prevented the rescuers from assessing the scale of the tragedy. They only realized the horror that befell the campsite the next morning. Guests and rescuers wandered through the grounds covered in mud, searching for survivors and personal belongings. Where there used to be trees was now strewn with demolished cars and trailers. The camp streets had disappeared. Water, mud, and piles of rubble covered the entire area. Finding anyone was a true challenge. Even though trained dogs were brought in, the mud had hardened quickly, so rescuers battled to locate the bodies of both survivors and the dead buried beneath. The only way they could scan the ground was with the help of sticks, which was a slow and wearing process. Adding to the already challenging rescue, the torrent had carried bodies into the Gallego River. One victim was found 8 miles away in the Sabiñánigo swamp. Like many others, the force from the water was so powerful that it stripped their clothes off. The recovery operation lasted for days. Ambulances and helicopters transferred bodies to a makeshift morgue for identification. It was an arduous process. The police did not have exact information on the number of guests, nor did they know their identities. The reception computer was destroyed in the flood and rendered useless. Traumatized and numbed from the cold, the survivors were sent to Biescas, where a temporary shelter was established. Its residents showed solidarity for victims by offering them clothes, food, and accommodation in their homes. Experts claimed a flood like this only happens once every 200 years. But was that the case at the Biescas campsite? Many disagreed. The disaster didn't just come out of the blue, and it was actually people who got in the way of nature, not the other way around. Some blamed the camp's location at the mouth of the ravine that had shown a high flash flood potential in the past. In fact, following a dramatic flood 70 years earlier, authorities built a channel through the midline of the sediment deposit to direct water in case of heavy rainfall and protect the area. Furthermore, 36 sediment retention dams were built along the Eris ravine to prevent landslides. However, the system built to prevent floods only contributed to the 1996 tragedy. During the storm, the excess water rushed down the ravine. This overwhelmed and broke most of the dams, releasing the sediments that they stored. As this happened, it picked up roughly 6,000 truckloads of logs, mud, and rocks. Eventually, the debris was stopped by a bridge above the campground, but it couldn't bear the pressure and broke, letting loose a wave of rubble that overwhelmed the artificial channel and covered the campsite. 87 people died in the Biescas campsite disaster. The last body would only be discovered nearly a year later, on July 28, 1997. While workers were removing the ravine bed near the scene of the tragedy, they found the remains of a 6-year-old boy. Considering the destructive force of the flood, it was fortunate that more than 500 visitors survived the tragedy, many of whom were absent from the park at the time. The mayor of Biescas rejected all accusations, instead claiming that the campsite was built in accordance with regulations. Yet records showed that before the construction, a government official had issued a negative report precisely because of the location's risk. The government recklessly neglected an expert's opinion. Now it was time to pay the price for it. The court of Huesca dismissed a criminal charge, citing the flood as exceptional and unpredictable, which the victims' families rejected. Instead, they commenced a decade-long legal battle with authorities. Finally, in 2005, the National Court recognized the authorities' responsibility and ordered the government of Aragon and the Ministry of the Environment to jointly indemnify 63 of the 87 fatalities with 11.2 million euros. The government never paid its share of the compensation. As for the Las Nieves campsite, it was rebuilt but in a new, safer location. A memorial was erected where it once stood, a grim reminder that nature has its laws and you cannot bypass them. Moving from the Biescas flood, we turn to Germany, where a catastrophic crowd crush left the nation in shock. Love Parade is one of the biggest music festivals in Europe. A landmark of German popular culture, it has drawn millions of partygoers from around the world for over 2 decades. It's 2010, and the city of Duisburg is hosting the Techno Parade for the first time. Music trucks drive around the festival grounds, and some of Europe's top DJs are set to perform. Without a doubt, this is the party of a lifetime. Rivers of people are swarming toward the old freight station, where the free event is staged. At the main entrance, hundreds are waiting to get in. A cheerful crowd fills the main ramp leading toward the event area. However, with each minute, the crowd becomes larger and larger, causing the festive spirit to fade away slowly. Now, there are thousands of visitors tightly packed on the main ramp. Instead of joyful shouts, people start to scream and call for help. There's literally no room to breathe. The fun event turns into a horror scene, taking 21 young lives. It's a disaster no one expected to happen at a festival about love and joy. The Love Parade has caused controversy throughout its history. It started in 1989 as a parade of 150 people on the streets of West Berlin. 8 years later, it has become one of the largest parties in the world. 1 million festival goers danced on the Straße des 17. Juni in the center of the German capital. Despite this, as many people opposed the festival as there were attendees. Citizens and political parties were concerned about several issues that accompanied the Love Parade, such as environmental damage, illegal drug trafficking, and safety regulations. It was precisely because of the latter that the Senate of Berlin ultimately denied a permit to the event organizers. And so, in 2007, the Love Parade moved to the Ruhr area. The first host city was Essen, followed by Dortmund. In 2009, the Bochum Love Parade was canceled. Finally, in 2010, Duisburg hosted the event. Both love parades in Essen and Dortmund proved successful, with 1.2 million and 1.6 million visitors respectively, and the city of Duisburg wanted to be as successful. Being part of the European Capital of Culture campaign was more of a reason for it to host the event. The city's mayor, Adolf Sauerland, was determined to make the Love Parade the best ever, especially because of the forecast of 1.4 million visitors. The city's authorities' desire to organize the event at all costs was huge. First, there was a concern that the event site was inappropriate for so many people. The city and the Love Parade organizer, Loopevent GmbH, agreed to set the parade at the former freight station. With a total area of approximately 120,000 square yards, the site was too small to take 1.4 million visitors. To solve this issue, a compromise was made to limit the number of people on the site to 250,000. In addition, the entire area was fenced to meet the requirements of German safety regulations. The entry to the old freight station was more concerning than the relatively small area for the parade. The only way to arrive was via the tunneled Karl-Lehr Street. In the middle of the tunnel, an opening led toward the main entrance, across the so-called main ramp. This ramp was supposed to take on all visitors arriving at the parade. The problem was that the same route, including a narrower side ramp west of the main ramp, also served as the exit route from the main event area. This was not the first time for Loopevent GmbH and its owner, Rainier Schaller, to organize the parade. To clear up doubts regarding the safety issues, they hired a crowd researcher, who made a detailed study of an evacuation in case of danger. The calculations of the inflow and outflow of the visitors showed that the main ramp was suitable as an entry point. Bordered by high walls, it was 85 feet wide and 426 feet long. Its maximum flow would be approximately 115,000 visitors per hour. The most traffic was expected between 1,700 hours and 1,800 hours, with around 90,000 people arriving in the area and 55,000 people leaving. And yet, despite the plans and crowd expert studies, the parade somehow ended in a disaster. So why did they fail to see the danger coming? On July 24, 2010, the day of the Love Parade, crowds of people poured into Duisburg with great expectations. However, things started to get complicated before the event even started. Namely, the festival gates were to be opened at 11 o'clock, but due to prolonged construction work in the central area, the opening was delayed by about an hour. Therefore, when the gates finally opened at noon, a large group of people was already waiting to get in. In about an hour, thousands of partygoers lined up from both sides of the tunnel. At 1400 hours, the festival began. Floats, decorated music trucks carrying DJs and dancers formed a parade along the route, not far from the main entrance. The idea was for them to draw the visitors to join the parade and continue walking along the route. In reality, they only obstructed those entering the main area, thus slowing down the inflow. The jam at the float's path caused the concentration of people at the main ramp to increase. Already at 1442 hours, the entire main ramp, almost up to the tunnel, was crowded. The number of people waiting there surpassed the capabilities of the crowd manager and event security. Unable to keep the constant flow of people in and out of the main area, they tried to get support from the police, but couldn't establish contact since they had no walkie-talkies or mobile phones. 1530 hours. The police officer in charge finally contacted the crowd manager, trying to coordinate the crowd control actions. The plan was to engage the so-called pushers, whose role was to help people go forward and release the pressure at the main ramp. At the same time, the police would close the access points until the crowd was reduced and form a cordon in the middle of the ramp to shield visitors. Unfortunately, the plan failed almost immediately, as the pushers could not move the people toward the central area. Down the tunnel, the incoming festival goers were threatening to overcome the access control points. Facing the threat of the main ramp getting further overcrowded, the police reacted by forming two cordons at the end of each tunnel to stop the inflow of visitors. At 1600, the inflow of visitors was stopped and the jam began to form in the tunnel. At 1612, the police began to form a third cordon in the middle of the ramp, practically leaving very few people in the area between three cordons. No one was allowed to go through, but the problem was that no one was allowed to leave the site either. What the police believed to be a solution only aggravated the situation. The crowd between the third cordon and the entrance gates didn't reduce. The visitors trying to enter the festival area collided with those who wanted to leave. The number of people arriving at the parade was so large that it was only a matter of time before the cordons would break. Inevitably, the one at the tunnel's eastern end collapsed at 1614, followed by the one at the western end at 1621. Suddenly, a torrent of people rushed toward the main ramp where the third cordon was still holding the people in place. As a result, nobody could move in or out of the area on either side of the third police cordon. Some people began climbing poles, traffic signs, and other structures to reach the main site above them. Finally, under the crowd's pressure, the police dissolved the third cordon, leaving those on the main ramp on their own. 1627. Some visitors discovered a way to get out of the main ramp by using a narrow staircase at the western wall, right above the tunnel opening. In a flash, crowd turbulence arose in the area. Everyone wanted to get hold of the stairs and climb up. As police officers noticed the commotion around them, they tried to take control of it, but they were not successful. At this point, the situation started to slide into irreversible disaster. People kept pouring in from the west end of the tunnel, making the crowding near the narrow staircases unbearable. When the police removed the fence in the tunnel to let the ambulance car pass, hundreds of attendees used the opportunity to rush toward the ramp. Even the police's announcement that the festival area was full and would not be accessible until the end of the day didn't change things. The police and security completely lost control of the crowd, who were resolute in entering the festival. It was left to the festival goers to get out of the deadly crowd turbulence. Witnesses recalled the scene as painful to watch. People pushed each other, some even trying to climb over others to reach the staircase. Some tried to save themselves by climbing the light poles and the crowd control manager's container. It was important to get above the crowd if one wanted to survive. There were dozens of people unconscious, their bodies held upright by the dense mass. Many were reaching their hands in the air screaming for help as they struggled to stay on their feet. Here and there, a person would simply disappear in the stirring crowd. There were so many people in a tight place, that no one could gauge the scale of the disaster going on in front of their eyes. Not far from the main ramp, the parade's organizer, Rainier Schaller, was doing an interview describing the Duisburg Love Parade as a complete success. He wasn't aware that people were dying only a couple of hundred yards away from him. Emergency vehicles began arriving at the scene as dozens of people lay on the floor with no signs of life. At 17:02, the first fatalities were reported on the ramp. On the staircase, people were still pushing up toward the main festival area, with many falling on others' heads, realizing that it provided the only exit from the ramp and out of the crowd. The police tried to organize the people and limit the number of those climbing the stairs. The density at the ramp did reduce, but the situation was still critical. All over the place, desperate cries for help rang out. It was only at 17:16 that the situation at the ramp cleared up, exposing the victims lying unconscious as others tried to resuscitate them. Right next to them, in a terrifying scene, bodies were being pulled out of the pile of people. Once the scene cleared, police, security, and emergency crews jumped in to help the injured. Ambulance cars rushed in and out of the tunnel, taking the severely wounded to the hospital. On the ramp, with the help of visitors, medics were looking for survivors to provide them with first aid. Most of the injured had fainted due to the inability to breathe in the dense crowd. They had to be revived again. At that time, the party was still going on at the main festival area. However, upon learning what had happened on the main ramp, the organizers chose not to end it, fearing that the emergency evacuation of the site might lead to an even greater tragedy. The disaster at the main ramp resulted in the death of 21 people and more than 500 injured. 15 people died on the spot, while the other 6 later succumbed to injuries. All of the victims died from compressive asphyxia, the mechanical limiting of the lung expansion by compressing the torso that results in loss of breath. Simply put, air was cut off from the body due to outside pressure. Undoubtedly, it was the crowd turbulence that killed them. The question is, what caused the turbulence in the first place? A situation like this rarely happens by itself. Something had to incite it. Crowd turbulence such as the one at the Duisburg Love Parade are almost impossible to control once they start, and it is astounding how easily they can occur. The slow inflow of visitors to the main festival area, combined with police cordons, created a jam at the main ramp. Once the crowd became too big, the panic started to spread, and crowd turbulence began. There were many factors that contributed to the disaster, from the city officials who approved the festival to the event organizers and the police responsible for securing the site. Everyone was involved. The first thing that comes to mind is the choice of location. The old freight station as the festival area was relatively small for an event like Love Parade, especially compared to the site used in Berlin. The location was also constrained by both railway tracks and a freeway on both sides. However, the most controversial aspect was the main ramp's limitations, which were intended to welcome all festival goers. Even though the surface area theoretically allowed a steady inflow and outflow, in practice, it was limited by the installed fences, food stands, and police cars. Out of the ramp's total width of 85 feet, the effective width for the passage of visitors was only 36 feet. In addition, neither the tunnel nor the ramp had separate inflow and outflow paths, so people entering and leaving had to go through the same area. Experts formulated the concerns to the mayor in detail, who left the approval of the Love Parade to its administration because of a private vacation. In response, the administration urged the city to collaborate constructively, and their representative could deny any responsibility if the city approved the festival's location. On July 21st, 3 days before the festival, the building authority yielded under pressure and finally granted the permit. Mayor Adolf Sauerland gave the regulatory approval only a day before the event. Consequently, the Love Parade was organized in a hurry, so a number of things were overlooked. Eventually, a jam appeared at the main ramp, creating a situation that the event staff could not cope with. Once the police stepped in, it was likely that they were surprised by the sudden need to take control. They made a forced move of creating 3 cordons that not only didn't solve the problem, but made it much worse. When police cordons in the tunnel collapsed, several thousand visitors rushed toward the main ramp, creating a massive crowd. It was clear why the visitors and the public were furious with the people responsible for organizing the event. They demanded answers be given why 21 young lives were lost for no reason. The answer they received was more shocking than the tragedy itself. The day after the tragedy, the blame game began between the mayor, the organizer, and the police. The first to strike was the police trade union in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which accused the organizers of poor preparation for the event and putting material interests before the safety of people. It didn't take long for the organizer to respond. Rainer Schaller, German multimillionaire and owner of a successful chain of fitness studios, deflected responsibility. Schaller said all details were approved or specified by the authorities. Defending their position, the police responded that the tragedy in the tunnel and on the Love Parade grounds occurred within the responsibility of the city and the organizer. To quote, the police's area of responsibility ended at the isolation barriers. The accusations against the police were also made by Mayor Sauerland, whom, on the other hand, the public saw as the main culprit for the tragedy. His administration hastened the preparations and pushed building authorities and the fire department to approve the event's organization. Additionally, the city administration completely ignored all concerns expressed by experts regarding the safety of the visitors. The shadow of guilt hung over the police, the city, and the organizer for more than 5 years while the investigation was ongoing. The public prosecutor's office in Duisburg, leading the investigation, hired a renowned British expert for human compression, Keith Still. In December 2011, he presented his final report about the accident, based on which the prosecutor filed his charges. If those responsible for the organization and securing the event could not agree on who to blame, the court would rule it. And the court ruled it was no one's fault. On March 30, 2016, the district court in Duisburg decided not to proceed with the charges against 10 suspects, 6 from the city of Duisburg and the 4 employees of the Lopavent company. As stated in the court's decision, the prosecution failed to prove evidence of the alleged breaches of duty of care and their causality. Even though the prosecutor filed a complaint and took the case to the higher court, it all ended the same way. In 2019, the remaining 7 accused took the opportunity provided by German laws to have criminal charges against them dropped in exchange for paying a fine. For the rest of the accused, the trial was closed in April of 2020, when it became apparent that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the trial would not be complete before the statute of limitations of 10 years expired at the end of July. According to the court, it turned out that there were no culprits for the disaster. It just came out of nowhere, an insult to justice and above all else, to the victims' families. Mayor Adolf Sauerland was voted out of office in February 2012 in a special election organized based on citizens' petitions. He left the mayor's seat surprised that the voters had forgotten all the good things he did during his mandate. Rainer Schaller was never investigated. Up next is a derailment catastrophe that obliterated an entire town.
Everything's on fire from the church all the way down to the metro. Flames, RJ, are 200 feet high. It's incredible. You can't believe it here.
It's a warm, cozy July evening, and nothing seems out of the ordinary in the small town of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec, Canada. While most of the town is asleep, 1 hour past midnight, it's still busy at the downtown Musique Café. It's one of several spots where locals and tourists gather to relax and share their stories. Lac-Mégantic is the type of small community where everyone knows everyone by name. The murmur at the bar is suddenly interrupted by the loud sound of screeching train wheels. Freight trains pass daily up and down the track just a few yards away from the cafe. However, the intensity of the sound indicates something is wrong with this train. Then, 5 locomotives rush past at a staggering speed. They are followed by a composition of 72 tank cars filled with crude oil, grinding across the track and colliding against each other. Then, suddenly, the ground shakes when a powerful blast and heat wave hit the cafe. For almost 130 years, the railway has been the town's lifeline to the rest of the world. This night, however, it brings only death and devastation. An hour before midnight on July 5, 2013, a train entered the freight station at Nantes. The composition, comprising 5 locomotives, a buffer car, a remote control car, and 72 tank cars, was 4,700 feet long. It transported 2,160,000 gallons of crude oil from Newtown, North Dakota to the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. Along its path were 2 Canadian towns, Nantes and Lac-Mégantic. Operating the train was an experienced engineer, Tom Harding. Once he arrived at the Nantes station, Harding parked the train on the main line and left it to be taken over by another operator the following day. He was the only person on the train, but followed the complete parking procedure. After applying the air brake system, he engaged handbrakes on all 5 locomotives, a buffer car, and the first car. He then went through a brake test to check if the handbrakes alone were sufficient to hold the train. In addition, Harding contacted U.S. Rail Traffic Control to report an engine malfunction and smoke coming from the lead locomotive.
I only noticed when I got stopped here that she was smoking excessively, both black for a minute or so, and then she'd go white for a little bit and then go back to black again. I've been here there for, 9 minutes. The smoke has cleared. Like she said, there's less of smoke coming out of it right now. It's still changing colors back and forth there, black and white a little bit there, but maybe if she sits here for another hour or so, she'll settle right down. Well, that's all we can do, Tom. We'll check it tomorrow and see what she comes up with.
The lead locomotive was left running to maintain the pressure in the air brake system. Eventually, Harding called the local rail traffic controller, Richard Labrie. He reported that the train was secured and left for the local hotel. Harding didn't realize at that moment that the engine's problem was far more severe than he had imagined. Some time after he left, witnesses reported sparks flying out of the exhaust. It didn't take long for flames to come out. At 11:50 p.m., Nantes Fire Department received an emergency call about a locomotive on fire at the freight station. Within minutes, the firefighter crew was on site, dousing the blaze. At 11:59 p.m., Labrie called Harding.
It went on fire.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, is somebody up there to take care of it? Or?
Yeah, well, the firefighter were there.
Yes.
And apparently it's dead now.
Oh, fuck.
And the fire is all gone. It's extinguished.
Okay.
And that's all I know about it.
Do I need to go up there and start up a second?
No. Jean-Noël Biescas he went there to check if there's any damage, and he's gonna call me back.
Okay, call me back, RJ.
No, go to bed.
At 13 minutes past 12, 2 track maintenance employees from the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway arrived and took control of the train. The MME employees informed the firefighters the train was safe and everyone left the scene. The fire was extinguished and a possible disaster was avoided. Not for long, though. By 1 a.m., as one of the firefighters was returning home, he stopped at the railway crossing not far from the Nantes freight station. He saw the very same train he was saving from a fire a couple of minutes before, passing the crossing at a high speed, with no headlights nor the horn sound. It was as if a ghost train had passed. 11 miles down the track from Nantes lays the small town of Lac-Mégantic. It was around 1:15 a.m. when the train approached, traveling more than 60 miles per hour. The train speed limit in Lac-Mégantic urban area was only 10 miles per hour because of a long and sharp curve. Running through the town at a speed 6 times greater than allowed would undoubtedly result in derailment. And that was precisely what happened. The composition of 5 locomotives and remote control car did pass the curve, but the buffer car couldn't withstand the force and derailed. It dragged along the remaining 72 tank cars filled with crude oil. The crash of derailed cars then caused a series of massive explosions, ripping through downtown Lac-Mégantic. Closest to the blast was the Music Cafe. It was only by sheer luck that a few guests survived. The blast destroyed everything within a 1,000-yard radius. Giant orange fireballs lit up the night, rising hundreds of feet in the air. Unfortunately, the explosion was only a prelude to the disaster that would unfold over the next 2 days. Most of the derailed tanks ruptured during the collision and started leaking oil. More than 1.5 million gallons were set on fire and spread through the streets of Lac-Mégantic. The blaze consumed everything as far as the spilled oil reached. At 1:47 a.m., train operator Harding was evacuated from his hotel in Lac-Mégantic and called Richard Labrie, the traffic controller on duty.
Everything's on fire from the church all the way down to the metro, from the river all the way to the railway tracks. Flames, RJ, are 200 feet high. It's incredible. You can't believe it here.
The disaster caught the residents by surprise. Apocalyptic scenes saw them leave their houses, running through smoke and flames on the streets to save their lives. In agony, people jumped from the floors of their homes to avoid being burned alive. The explosion raised an all-out alarm. Around 150 firefighters were dispatched to the scene. However, it took them almost a whole day to reach the center of the fire, the derailed tanks from which oil was still leaking in torrents. At one point, a special fire retardant foam was brought in from the nearby oil refinery to help the firefighters extinguish it. They finally succeeded in the late hours of Sunday, July 7th. Hospital staff went into standby mode when the alarm went off, expecting many injuries. However, during the 2 days of the fire, only one resident came to treat his second-degree burns. The disaster left no room for injured. People either escaped the fire or were burned alive. In the end, 47 people were killed by the explosion and the blaze. Their bodies were burned beyond recognition, so the coroners had to use DNA samples to identify them. 5 bodies were never found and were assumed to have been vaporized by the explosion. Almost half of Lac-Mégantic's downtown was destroyed, while the remaining houses had to be demolished due to oil contamination. The disaster left 1,000 people homeless, while another 1,000 had to move out of their houses because of the toxic fumes. It also inflicted a long-term impact on the environment and the lives of the residents because of the 26,000 gallons of oil that leaked into the Chaudière River and nearby lake. In an instant, a quiet, picturesque town had become an inferno. In the middle of it all, Tom Harding was unaware that it was his train that caused the disaster.
Is it the train that will run down?
No, I had all of the police here around me because they know I work for the railway. We got a loaded train up at Nantes. It's okay.
It took 1 more hour until Labrie discovered the awful truth. A local taxi dispatcher informed him that Harding's train indeed derailed and exploded. Labrie couldn't believe what he was hearing.
Les engins ont probablement parti de Nantes, sont descendus, puis quand ça a rentré au centre-ville, ça tout a pété.
T'es sérieux, toi, là?
Oui.
C'est le train qui a descendu?
C'est le train qui a descendu.
Ah, non.
Mon chauffeur il a vu passer les engins. C'est le train qui a descendu. Rendu juste dans le centre-ville.
Ah.
Il n'y a plus de centre-ville.
Ah, non.
Je te dis, le centre-ville complet, là, c'est pas... Juste que le centre-ville, là, ça s'éteint chaque barre, puis ça brûle, puis ça explose.
Labrie then informed Harding that it was his train that went loose and set the town ablaze. Harding was shocked. He could have sworn everything was in order when he left it.
It's your train that rolled down?
No.
Yes, sir.
No, RJ.
Yes, sir.
Holy...
Yes, sir. That's what I got. It was confirmed at 2:30.
At 2:30 that the fuel train rolled down here.
Yeah.
Oh, tabarnak, tabarnak. And it was secure, RJ, when I left.
Yeah.
She was secure.
That's what I got as a news.
And when did you get the news? Just a few minutes ago?
2:25 to be correct.
How in the did that thing roll down, RJ?
I don't know. How many brakes did you put on?
The units, the VB, and the first car, 7 brakes.
To understand how it came to this, we have to take a more detailed look at what else happened during the night of July 5th. As scheduled, the tanker train operated by the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway arrived at the Nantes freight station. Harding parked and secured the train by switching on the air brake system that locked all the wheels. As a precautionary measure, he also applied hand brakes on all 5 locomotives, plus 2 cars, in case the air brake system failed. However, since the train was left on a slope, he was supposed to apply hand brakes on at least twice as many tank cars. He probably didn't do this because he was the only person on duty, and applying a single brake was a 3-minute-long procedure that required a lot of strength. Afterward, Harding performed a required brake test to ensure the train would be held by hand brakes alone. Unfortunately, he accidentally left the air brakes on during the test, which led him to believe the hand brakes would hold the train. In any case, Harding left the lead engine running to maintain the pressure in the air brake system. With the air brakes applied, there was no chance the train would move, and yet it did, somehow. 8 months before the accident, the locomotive had been sent to a repair shop because of engine failure. To save time, MMA's managers decided to repair the engine with a part of insufficient strength and durability. Shipping oil was lucrative. They didn't want to afford an idle locomotive. On the day of the disaster, the low-grade part failed, allowing oil to leak into the body of the turbocharger. Since the engine was left running, the oil kept accumulating, and once it overheated, it set the whole engine on fire. The firefighters were quick to react, though, and prevented the fire from spreading. However, to extinguish it, they had to kill the engine. By turning the engine off, they cut the air brake system's air supply. Unfortunately, track MMA maintenance employees sent to the scene were not train operators and were unaware of the consequences of leaving the locomotive engine turned off. If Operator Harding had been present, he would have surely restarted the engine, but his colleague assured him he wouldn't have to make the trip. After the fire was extinguished, the firefighters and the MMA's employees left the scene, convinced everything was in perfect order. In truth, a tragedy was just about to unfold. Without the engine running, the air brake system gradually lost all pressure. As a result, the train was lying on sloped tracks on handbrakes only. A standard procedure in most railway systems was to park the train on side tracks equipped with buffer stops, but the MMA's guidelines allowed parking on the main track. So with no sufficient brakes, the train carrying more than 2 million gallons of oil started to move down the tracks. To make things worse, the tracks from Nantes to Lac-Mégantic were dropping 4 feet each 100 yards. By the time it reached the curve at Lac-Mégantic, the 10,287 metric ton heavy train had accelerated enough to derail. Undoubtedly, the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster resulted from poor management systems and inadequate regulations. Those were the conclusions reached by the Federal Transportation Safety Board in its 181-page accident report. Most of the blame was put on the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway for failing to operate the trains safely, and on Transport Canada, the federal institution responsible for transportation policies. The MMA, however, turned the blame toward its own people. Tom Harding, in charge of operating the train on the night of the accident, and Richard Labrie and Jean Demaitre, the railway traffic controller and the manager of train operations. The 3 were arrested in 2014 and charged with 1 count of criminal negligence for causing the death of 47 people. During the 1-month trial, the defense based their case on claiming the accused had no proper safety training and everything they did on the night of the tragedy was according to the company's regulations. The 3 served as scapegoats, while the actual blame was on those who ran the railroads with less money for more profit. Ultimately, all 3 accused were relieved from charges, to the delight of their co-workers and the residents of Lac-Mégantic. But To their disappointment, the MMA and the Canadian Pacific Railway, as the main contractor, got away with it. In August 2013, the company filed for bankruptcy protection both in Canada and the United States, as it lacked the assets or insurance to compensate disaster victims. Other companies sued in class action lawsuits agreed to pay money into a settlement fund for victims in exchange for being removed from the case. Ultimately, they paid $450 million to victims and other creditors. The Canadian and American federal authorities responded to the disaster by announcing a series of security measures, including new safety standards for cars, speed limits in urban areas, and required electronic braking systems. Although, after more than a decade, the railways are still refusing to implement the standards that collide with their economic interests. Next, we turn to a 62-mile ultramarathon that killed 21 runners. Coming from the steppes of Mongolia, a cold front descended on the Yellow River stone forest in northern China. In just a couple of hours, what seemed to be a chilly day turned into a superstorm. The temperature suddenly plummeted to -5 degrees Celsius as the wind reached a gale force. Behind the rock, sheltered from the blizzard of hailstones that battered the ground, there was a man curled up. A runner, wearing little more than shorts and a t-shirt, was shivering in the cold. His mouth was foaming and he barely had a pulse. Throughout the area, dozens of other runners were in the same trouble. They climbed the mountain trying to win a race, but ended up fighting the storm to save their bare lives. It was May 22, 2021. The Yellow River Stone Forest National Geological Park in China hosted a 100-kilometer trail running race. This challenging sporting discipline gathered thousands of competitors, including some of the best runners from around the country and abroad. The participants gathered along Mijiashan Hill for the fourth time. The extraordinarily demanding and enduring race was reserved only for experienced athletes who could prove they'd completed a similar race within the last year. However, by the sport's standards, the trail was considered one of the easiest in the race calendar. Its total elevation was less than 3,000 meters, not much compared to other trails in China. Moreover, the terrain was not too complicated and could be run. Still, the path had some tricky sections, the most difficult being the 8-kilometer stretch between checkpoints 2 and 3. This part, named No Man's Land, was a steep, narrow stone and sand path inaccessible to vehicles. It ended with the highest trail elevation of 2,230 meters, and at points, runners had to use both hands and feet to climb up. This section of trail is where the disaster took place. The race was organized by the Baiyan Prefecture and Jingtai County's Communist Party Committee to improve the region's tourist offer. They were meant to supervise the on-field organizers of the race. However, they were not too bothered about their duty. As a result, the complete control over both the race and everything else required was in the hands of on-field organizers and a sports marketing company that supported the event. Unfortunately, these people had little experience in the job, leading to the fatal outcome. On May 21st, the event team met before the race to explain the route to competitors. There were 10 checkpoints, and an estimated closing time was 20 hours, which meant runners would have to spend the night somewhere on the way. So, at checkpoint number 6, the organizers set up a changing station where participants could change their shoes or clothes and grab something to eat. They also offered to transfer the runners' backpacks to this checkpoint beforehand. The problem was that there was no staff assigned to other checkpoints besides that one. As a result, no one was there to report on runners who went missing when disaster struck. What's worse, there were blind spots for mobile phone signal, no man's land included, an unknown fact to organizers. The most significant oversight was ignoring the special weather report made by the Gansu Provincial Meteorological Bureau. From the 21st to the 22nd, there will be a strong wind, sand, and dust, cooling, and precipitation in Gansu Province. May has entered a period of frequent, strong convective weather. Pay attention to prevent short-term heavy precipitation, hail, thunder and lightning, and arrays, adverse effects such as high winds. 3 years prior, the weather had been warm and sunny, and the organizers believed it would be the same this year. On the morning of the race, May 22nd, it became evident that the weather would be anything but pleasant. Some runners took shelter from the wind that became stronger each hour. They were only wearing shorts and t-shirts. Their windbreaker jackets were packed with the rest of their stuff and taken to checkpoint 6 before the race. At 9 a.m., the race began. The real fuel temperature was 7 degrees Celsius. As the runners were passing through checkpoints, the weather was worsening. In the distance, there were dark clouds and strong wind. At 11 a.m., it started raining. The leading pack of competitors had already passed checkpoint 2 when it became apparent the storm was coming. About 3 hours into the race, the temperature suddenly dropped and hail started to beat down. At that moment, a pack of runners was crossing the most challenging part of the trail, a section near checkpoint 3. Despite the warnings from some of the racers who had quit and were descending the course, they continued up. Unfortunately, it was this group of runners that took the most of the casualties. The first distress call was just after midday in the event group. The organizers sent the initial rescue team to look for the runners. Luckily, most had either descended or hadn't reached the most challenging section. Many found shelter in stone houses along the road, where rescue teams later picked them up. Sadly, the runners near checkpoint 3 weren't as lucky. They went deep into the no man's land, and there was no way for them to return once the storm began. The weather changed so quickly that the participants had little time to hide. They were soaking wet, their faces and bodies bruised by hailstones. The heavy hail reduced the visibility drastically. It was no wonder runners became disoriented. While some tried to hide behind rocks, others got lost trying to find shelter. The runners began slipping into hypothermia as the temperature dropped to -5 degrees Celsius between 20 past 11 and 10 to 2. They were losing feeling in their legs and losing consciousness. A storm of this magnitude was certain death. It was a sheer miracle that a local 49-year-old goat herder, Zhu Kemming, was hiding in a nearby cave, which he used as a shelter in bad weather. At 2 p.m., he noticed a disoriented runner up in front of his cave. He took him in, placing him by the fire. Kemming gave him a quilt to warm up. Soon, 5 more runners found refuge in Kemming's cave. Inside, the 6 of them dried their clothes and recovered their strength by warmth of a fire. The rescue team later collected them. At around 4 p.m., Kemming managed to find phone signal and inform nearby villagers of the runners trapped up in the mountains by the bad weather. Locals rushed out to help, carrying warm clothes and quilts. Ultimately, most of the survivors were saved by the locals who took them to shelter caves. At the same time, Jingtai County firefighters were sent to the rescue. However, the farthest they could go by car was checkpoint 4. From there, they had to walk uphill to reach the section where the lost runners were. Subsequently, once they arrived at the scene at 9 p.m., the rescue mission had turned into a body recovery mission. The authorities were quick to determine the causes of the tragedy and the responsibility of the organizers. Less than a fifth of races in 2019 were certified by the China Athletic Association. An astonishing number were led by teams inexperienced in arranging such events. All of the Gansu Ultramarathon staff were part-time workers, none of them having any previous experience in event organization. A private-owned Blue Sky Rescue Search team hired to cover the race was ill-equipped and ill-prepared to respond to the situation. The organizer also failed to meet the basic safety standards. Most of the runners on the Gansu race lacked mandatory warm weather gear, having given their warm clothes to the crew to take it to checkpoint 6. However, the organizers' most crucial oversight was neglecting the weather report. Even when it became evident that the weather was deteriorating, the organizers were hesitant to cancel the race. They only did it when it was too late for runners who had reached deep into the section between checkpoints 2 and 3. Bodies of 21 runners, 18 men, and 3 women were recovered. Unfortunately, they had all died of hypothermia. Out of the 172 runners, only 4 reached checkpoint 4. the number of casualties made the Gansu Ultramarathon disaster the deadliest yet. In a familiar pattern in Chinese politics, the local authorities were the first to blame for the disaster. A brief 2-week inspection ended with 31 charges. 5 employees of the company that organized the ultramarathon were faced with criminal charges. 26 local party officials were disciplined, some only with administrative warnings. Others, however, had to face the loss of their jobs, detention, and criminal investigations. China's General Administration of Sport halted all high-risk sporting events, including marathons that lacked a clear oversight body, established rules, and safety standards. Following Gansu is another tragedy, possibly the worst shipwreck you haven't heard about. It's a routine trip carrying holidaymakers to visit family when tragedy strikes the Dona Paz. Petrified passengers risk their lives as they take the leap from the floating ball of flames. For some, it's a fatal decision either way. And it's not the first time the shipping company has faced an avoidable accident, nor will it be the last. As the Dona Paz sets off on the 20th of December 1987, everyone expects it to arrive at its destination. The Filipino-registered passenger ferry takes the journey from Tacloban to Manila twice a week. Though the sinking of the Dona Paz is believed to be the largest maritime disaster in times of peace, it is probably one of the least known tragedies to date. En route, the inter-island passenger ferry collided with a Filipino-owned oil tanker, the MT Vector, at Dumali Point, near the island of Marinduque. The oil tanker is on its way from Bataan to Masbate, carrying 1,041 tons of gasoline and petroleum products for Caltex Philippines. Sadly, neither the passenger ferry nor the oil tanker would ever reach their destination, and only 24 passengers from the ferry and 2 crew members from the oil tanker would live to tell the story of what happened that fateful evening. Since none of the Dona Paz crew survived, and the 2 crew members from the Vector were reportedly asleep at the time of the collision, only the accounts of the survivors can help us piece together what caused the tragedy. It is estimated that up to 16 million islanders travel between some 7,000 islands every year in the Philippines, making ferry travel the most economical mode for many locals. According to subsequent reports, overcrowding on passenger ferries is notorious in the country, but even more so on this occasion. Just 5 days before Christmas. On Sunday, 20 December, the Dona Paz was making its way to Manila, with many excited islanders hoping to meet up with family for the festive season. Witness accounts claim that the vessel, registered to carry just over 1,500 passengers, was reportedly leaning significantly more to one side when it left the port, indicating that it was heavily loaded. At 6:30 a.m., Dona Paz left the island of Leyte, setting sail for the overnight trip to Manila. According to the ship's initial manifest, the vessel carried 1,493 passengers and 59 crew members. In contrast, survivors say the ferry was jam-packed. One of the survivors, Ludia Bascal, who was traveling with her father Salvador, told a National Geographic film crew that the passengers were crammed into the ferry like cockroaches or ants. She said she saw 4 or more people sharing makeshift cots while hundreds tried to get comfortable on the floors of the 3-deck ferry. In the same documentary, another survivor, military officer Luzgardo Nido, says he and about 1,000 soldiers boarded at the last minute and were therefore not included on the ship's official manifest. It is also believed that about 1,000 children under the age of 4, as estimated by the survivors, were also left off the manifest. This meant that the estimated head count was double what it was said to be, with more than 3,000 people on board. At around 10 that evening, many passengers were trying to sleep as the ferry was due to dock in Manila at around 4:30 a.m., a mere 6 hours away. According to survivors, the evening was clear and the waters choppy as the Dona Paz made its way down the Tablas Strait. Aludia's father, Salvador Bascal, found himself on the top deck that evening and saw a ship's lights heading towards the ferry. He would soon realize that the boat was sailing way too close and realize that it was going to crash into their vessel, That ship was, of course, the 629-ton, steel-hulled MT Vector, carrying thousands of barrels of highly flammable fuel products, along with its crew of 13. Yet despite good visibility and calm sea conditions, the Vector rammed right into the port side of the Dona Paz, setting off an explosion that ripped through the engine room and main switchboard on the ferry. Survivors say the fire spread rapidly through the vessel, leaving multiple passengers trapped by the inferno, unable to reach the decks. It's believed the explosion led to a blackout on board, which caused a frantic stampede in overcrowded corridors as people tried to escape the flames and toxic fumes. According to reports, hundreds of passengers who made it to the top deck near the ship's railings threw themselves overboard into notoriously shark-infested waters of the strait rather than risk dying in the flaming inferno on the ferry. But they did not know at the time that the explosive cargo caused a blast on the tanker, quickly turning the surrounding waters into a sea of fire. Nido, the military officer, was reportedly one of the first people to jump ship at the moment of impact. According to him, both vessels exploded a minute later, igniting the thick oil slick on the water. Aludia, who managed to jump overboard, quickly realized that the sea was on fire and resided in the fact that she would probably die there. Reports indicate that the flames on the water quickly grew miles wide around the vessels as the evening winds fanned the fire on. As passengers hurled themselves into the ocean, they discovered to their horror that the waters around the ships were littered with the burnt corpses of their fellow passengers. Aludia said she had a tough time staying afloat and soon realized that the water was heating up and started boiling the survivors alive. But just as she gave up the fight to stay alive, her father, Salvador, found her. Her skin peeled off as he grabbed her. The two said they swam for over an hour to escape the hot waters burning them. With little strength left to continue their fight for survival, the pair was scooped out of the waters by a cargo vessel, the Don Claudio, which rescued them and the rest of the survivors. According to maritime investigations and the missing people's reports, it's believed that more than 4,300 people were traveling on the ferry that evening. Tragically, only 24 passengers survived, along with 2 crew members from the oil tanker. Many had to receive emergency treatment for third-degree burns. Some survivors even spoke of seeing the skin falling and peeling from those around them. In 2012, it came to light that there were in fact 25 Dona Paz survivors when Valeriana Duma made it known via a television show called Wish Ko Long. Just 14 at the time, Duma was not accounted for by officials, making her the youngest survivor. It took less than 2 hours for the Dona Paz to meet her watery final resting place. Arnel Galang, 18 at the time, told reporters the ship was engulfed in flames and rotated twice before sinking slowly. The MT Vector went down 4 hours after the initial explosion. The Philippine maritime authorities reportedly only learned about the collision 8 hours after the incident. It would take the authorities yet another 8 hours to mount a coordinated search and rescue operation. Over the following days, only 207 bodies washed up on the shores of the Tablas Strait. Many believe that so few bodies were recovered due to the area being infamous for man-eating sharks. Maritime experts, however, believe it is more likely that passengers on the ferry died in the overcrowded lower decks, overcome by the flames and unable to find their way to the top decks. But how exactly did these two vessels collide? Reports based on witness accounts found that it was a clear evening, which meant that visibility was good. Both vessels had their lights on and were moving pretty slowly at the time, the Dona Paz at 16 miles per hour and the Vector at a mere 5 miles per hour. It's also believed that the ships were surrounded by more than 11.5 square miles of open seas, allowing enough room to avoid a collision. So what happened that night? According to a surviving crew member of the Vector, Second Officer Reynaldo Tarife, the vessel was understaffed. Neither he nor Captain Celso Abella had the necessary licenses. Captain Abella only had a second officer's license, while the chief and chief engineer were not licensed at all. On top of that, the Vector did not have a certificate of inspection, making the vessel unseaworthy at the time. The Board of Marine Inquiry, looking into the incident, found that 2 people were needed to steer the wheel of the tanker due to the ship's weight, which resulted in a zigzag motion toward the Dona Paz, which may have confused the crew. Still, with plenty of room to maneuver on the open seas, why didn't the Dona Paz move out of the way? Well, according to the signed affidavits of the survivors, the vessel's captain, Eusebio Nazareno, was allegedly watching a movie at the time of the collision. The other 2 senior officers were reportedly seen drinking beers. Military survivor Nito said he was chatting to a fellow soldier before the crash who told him there was a party at the bridge, which the captain was at. Nito added that the soldier surmised that it meant that an apprentice mate was probably steering the ship at the time. And why didn't the vessels radio each other? Based on investigations by the Board of Marine Inquiry, the Vector had an expired radio license, and the Dona Paz carried a fake one. So, who is to blame for this tragedy? The board found that the fatal incident was due to a series of safety malpractices on both vessels. The owners of the Vector were found liable as the ship was not seaworthy and operated without a license, a lookout, and a qualified captain. The board subsequently found against the Vector's operator and owner Francisco Sorian and the Vector Shipping Corporation, absolving the Dona Paz's owners, Sulpicio Lines, of any liability for the accident. But the Philippine Coast Guard investigations found that none of the Dona Paz's crew was stationed at their posts when the collision occurred, leaving only 1 apprentice to man the ship's bridge. The crew also gave no guidance regarding evacuation efforts on the ferry, which was exacerbated by the lack of life vests locked away on the deck's lockers. Attorneys representing the Vector's owners added that the Dona Paz had been refurbished in the early 1980s, adding 2 more decks to the vessel to allow more passengers. However, the ship's certificate of stability was issued in 1980 based on 2, not the 4 decks it had when it went down. This meant that the Dona Paz was actually not seaworthy at the time of the collision, as the stability certificate which was issued would not take into account the extra 2 decks. The stability certificate essentially regulates that the ship has the ability to return to an even keel if there is any inclination caused by outside factors, like strong winds or waves when a ship turns. We know by way of witness accounts that the ship was already listing to one side due to overcrowding, which could have affected the ship's ability to steer out of the way of the approaching oil tanker. It appears, however, that tragedy and heartache was to follow Sulpicio Lines. The owner of the company has been involved in 4 shipping accidents that claimed the lives of around 5,000 people over a period of 11 years. The last incident in 2008 saw the Princess of the Star go down near Sibuyan Island, killing around 800 people. A memorial honoring the victims of the tragedy was held in a park in Catbalogan, the ship's last stopover before it set sail on that fateful trip. The memorial site at Pieta, which means pity in Italian, allows family and friends of the victims a space to honor their lives in the absence of burial sites, as many bodies were not recovered. Sulpicio Lines has since changed its name and operates under Philippine Span Asia Carrier Corporation, limited now to only carrying cargo. Next, it's the 2023 toxic train disaster that caused panic across Ohio. The quiet town of East Palestine, Ohio, became a household name when a freight train with a heavy cocktail of explosive chemicals derailed and burst into flames. But the true magnitude of the situation would only become known in the weeks and months to follow. The 150-car freight train operated by Norfolk Southern left Madison, Illinois on Wednesday, February 1, 2023. It was a routine run to Conway in Pennsylvania, home to one of the largest rail yards in the U.S. The most direct route would have run along Lake Erie to Cleveland, passing through several towns on the way. It would then take another track to Alliance, which runs eastward. But the situation quickly deteriorated. In this video, we'll explore why, with an average of more than 3 train derailments per day, this one is so controversial. We'll look at how the incident went viral on social media and quickly turned political. As the train entered Salem, about 20 miles from East Palestine, security footage captured flames emanating from the undercarriage of one of the cars. In less than an hour, it would hurtle toward a catastrophic fate. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, the 3rd of February, disaster struck in the peaceful enclave of East Palestine when the train derailed, triggering an explosive blast, leaving devastation in its wake. And the residents had no idea this would merely be the beginning of an environmental nightmare. The preliminary National Transportation Safety Board's report found that an engineer slowed and stopped the rail cars after receiving a critical audible alarm message, signaling an overheated axle. Only once the 9,000-foot train came to a complete stop did the crew see the fire and alert emergency services of a possible derailment. The problem was, of the 38 cars involved, 10 held highly hazardous materials. In fact, one of the chemicals transported was more than 115,000 gallons of vinyl chloride, a carcinogenic gas used to manufacture plastics that, if inhaled, can increase the risk of liver, brain, and lung cancer. Additionally, the small town, with a population of 4,700, only had one full-time firefighter who was supported by volunteers. However, they had no hazmat training or access to specialized equipment. Around 300 firefighters from 50 different departments rushed to the scene, but more than 6 hours passed before those trained in flammable liquid emergencies arrived from nearby East Liverpool. To make matters worse, visibility was poor, and many of the signage boards on overturned rail cars were destroyed. Crews couldn't tell which chemicals were leaking while they caught fire around them. The fire was burning so hot that responders' gear was disintegrating.
When I got down there, there was fire everywhere. They were put into a very dangerous situation, and they kept our town safe.
Shortly after 10 p.m., hundreds of residents within a 1-mile radius of the derailment area were evacuated.
To leave the area immediately. This is the Ohio State Highway Patrol.
I was very fearful of our residents. As soon as we found exactly what was out, that's when I issued the order to get out.
In the early hours of the morning, members of the Environmental Protection Agency arrived on the scene to monitor and measure volatile organic compounds in the air. Initial readings showed no signs of dangerous pollutants except tiny particles called particulate matter, which was considered safe for the surrounding communities. Crews, however, discovered contaminated runoff in 2 surface water streams, Sulphur Run and Leslie Run. In response, Norfolk Southern emergency contractors installed booms and underflow dams to restrict the flow of contaminated water and contain and collect the floating product. Soon, aeration pumps were installed along the 2 streams to remove traces of chemicals from the creek water. 3 days later, the inferno was still blazing, and officials confirmed the burning chemical was vinyl chloride. Concerns were mounting around the rising temperature inside one of the hazmat cars, and fears escalated that an explosion could launch shrapnel up to a mile away. Rather than let that happen, authorities issued a shelter-in-place order for the entire town, as well as opting for the controlled release of the vinyl chloride. Officials warned that the controlled burn would result in phosgene and hydrogen chloride in the air. Phosgene is a highly toxic gas that was used as a weapon in World War I. It causes vomiting, breathing difficulties, and burning sensations in the throat and eyes. This imminent threat prompted the enlargement of the evacuation zone to a 1 by 2 mile area around East Palestine, just hours before the controlled release. The release happened 4 days after the derailment, using small charges to create holes in the tanks measuring around 3 inches in diameter. The hazmat would then slowly be channeled into trenches dug into the ground, where the flares were lined up to ignite the chemical and burn it off. Whatever remained would then be treated or removed. The controlled burn sent a gigantic black cloud of toxic smoke into the air. The fire lasted several hours, leaving a haze of dense smoke and noxious fumes smelling like burning plastic. Even though roaming EPA monitors still did not seem to detect excessive harmful gas levels after the release, particulate matter levels increased at specific locations in the hours following the derailment and controlled burn.
These aren't storm clouds. This is that they burn off they burn off in East Palestine. This is not storm clouds. Look at it. This is over Darlington.
The evacuation order was lifted 2 days later, after hundreds of air quality samples tested below safety screening, including the inside of more than 500 homes. Tap water from the municipal system also didn't indicate signs of dangerous chemicals. Yet community members remained skeptical about returning to their home, with many wary about the chemical smell, like paint thinners or chlorine, hanging in the air. And after their homecoming, several locals began complaining about rashes, sore throats, nausea, and headaches, raising fears that the air was not as safe as authorities claimed. Nearly 5 days after the derailment, the first of many class action lawsuits were filed against Norfolk Southern. According to the suit, the rail company failed to exercise reasonable care for residents affected by the disaster and the consequent release of hazardous chemicals. That same evening, Norfolk Southern restarted operations on its main Cleveland-Pittsburgh line through East Palestine. More than 10 days after the derailment, disgruntled community members were set to meet with officials, including Norfolk Southern representatives, to discuss growing concerns around health and safety issues. But local leaders were left to take questions from the emotional residents because the company backed out of the meeting, saying it feared for the safety of its employees. Norfolk Southern, meanwhile, started offering affected residents $1,000 in inconvenience fees for evacuations, reneging on an earlier offer to pay for motel accommodations. At the same time, the NTSB released its preliminary report that found a severely overheated wheel bearing had failed during an emergency stop, leading to the derailment. The NTSB did, however, have some strong words about the incident.
This was 100% preventable. We call things accidents. There is no accident. Every single event that we investigate is preventable. So our hearts are with you. Know that the NTSB has one goal, and that is safety and ensuring that this never happens again.
The report found no wrongdoing by the crew or any issues with the track or the heat detectors that sounded the alarm. So the question remains, who is to blame for this disaster? Many industry insiders feel a business model adopted by rail companies led to the derailment. Precision schedule railroading makes the business more profitable by making trains longer, reducing staff, and deferring maintenance work for as long as possible.
Cut their workforce to bare bones, and now they're paying the price for it because the wheels are falling off the train, basically. Carmen were inspecting cars about 3 minutes per car. That's always been the industry standard. Now it's 90 seconds per car.
Is that because of PSR?
Yes, it's a rush job right now. And these guys are under pressure. I mean, they're working men and women, and, if they don't hurry up and get this car done, they're going to be fired.
The EPA, meanwhile, ordered Norfolk Southern to handle and pay for the cleanup. The legally binding order requires the company to identify and clean up any contaminated soil and water resources, attend public meetings at the EPA's request, and pay for the EPA's cost for work performed under the order. But the cleaning up operation was not without hitches. Nearby states were vehemently against hazmat waste from East Palestine being disposed of in their towns, but the EPA acted swiftly, saying that any states preventing them would violate federal law. Since then, neither the EPA nor Norfolk Southern has disclosed where the waste is going, although daily reports provide updates on the quantities. According to the Ohio EPA, Approximately 12 million gallons of liquid wastewater and about 25,000 tons of soil were removed within 2 months. There, around 12,000 tons of excavated soil was left to clear. A month later, another Norfolk Southern train derailed, this time in Springfield, Ohio, but it would appear that there's no stopping Norfolk Southern's trail of disaster. Days later, a third train derailed just outside Alabama, hours before the CEO was due to address the Senate on proposed security overhauls. Although the wheels of change move slowly when it comes to safety protocols in the rail industry, change moved rapidly in the nation's legislature. Lawmakers recognized a need for stricter regulations as a rare opportunity for bipartisan cooperation through the Railway Safety Act of 2023. Among several safety overhauls, the proposed legislation will require trains to have crews of at least 2 people, expanding the classification for highly hazardous flammable trains, and increased fines for safety violations and higher investment into first responder training for hazmat situations. When the smoke from the derailment is cleared, residents believed it was all smoke and mirrors from authorities. Posts on social media showed contradictory evidence to what officials claimed, and residents are still concerned about the health effects and environmental impacts on drinking water. Several videos surfaced of waterways in East Palestine which appear to have a rainbow-like slick on the surface. Ohio officials downplayed the videos, saying that it's a section of Sulphur Creek close to the derailment site that is severely contaminated, adding that it was dammed in 2 places after the derailment to prevent other local waterways from contamination. Still, the footage of the chemical rainbows was also visible on surfaces of adjacent lakes, leaving residents even more skeptical about the true scale of the impact on the environment. While there has been no report of groundwater contamination, scientists warn it may take time for hazardous chemicals to pass through soil and enter the water, and it is not only humans who have been affected. According to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, nearly 44,000 small fish, crayfish, amphibians, and other species have died near the crash site. Officials, however, have yet to confirm if any non-aquatic wildlife deaths could be connected to the train derailment. 2 months after the disaster, test results still show no harmful contamination in municipal drinking water. However, locals with private wells were urged to continue drinking bottled water until tests have been completed. Meanwhile, things have gone from bad to worse for Norfolk Southern. Adding to the company's woes, it now faces a series of lawsuits from Ohio, Pennsylvania's school district, and the U.S. Justice Department. Ohio has accused the company of violating state and federal laws and disregarding environmental regulations. At the same time, Pennsylvania's school district claimed that the accident led to toxic chemicals seeping into the ground and air, which could potentially pollute waterways. And the Justice Department demanded that the company pay for the cleanup costs and penalties for releasing hazardous chemicals, which the EPA says should be completed in 2 months' time. To date, Norfolk Southern has already reportedly forked out over $24 million for reimbursement and cleaning up expenses, with the business making a record $4.8 billion in 2022. This shouldn't hurt too much. They have also promised to create funds for long-term issues such as healthcare, property prices, and water standards. As for who will ultimately be held responsible, for now, it's a waiting game. A more thorough NTSB report on the incident is only expected to be released in about 18 months, when it is scheduled to wrap up its investigations. But many believe that the true extent of the environmental and health effects will only be known in the months and years to come. Thank you for watching to the end. If you like this video, watch more here, and please comment and subscribe for more.